Hello and welcome to this segment of Good Grief. My name is Lesel Dawson and I'm really delighted to be joined today by Liz Gleeson, who is a grief therapist, and she's also the creator and curator of Shapes of Grief, a really, really wonderful podcast, which if you haven't listened to, I do encourage you to have a listen. Liz, do you want to say anything about your podcast, first of all?
Yeah, thanks so much, Liesl. Thanks for the invitation to be here. And well done on everything you're doing for the Good Grief Fest. There's lots of interesting speakers in there, and I'm delighted to be one of them now. The podcast Shapes of Grief started 2 years ago. And I'd been working as a grief therapist for about 5 years. And it just struck me, as each new client came in, how they were so stunned and shocked by how profound grief was touching them. And it really, jumped out at me that people just do not understand grief until it hits them. And it was important to me to feel, what could I do rather than just one person at a time? What could I do with maybe my knowledge and my wisdom that would help to educate people more generally about grief? Because let's face it, not everybody can afford grief therapy or grief counseling. It's very much something for the privileged. So this was my way, I suppose, of being of service, giving back a little bit, and sharing stories of grief. That was my intention, so that people listening in could understand, okay, it's not just me. This is a really, really hard process that many people go through, and that they're not alone in that. And then I suppose also, secondly, the name is really important, Shapes of Grief. Many of us understand grief to be the resulting emotion following a bereavement. But grief has so many different shapes and forms that people aren't aware of. Divorce, separation, miscarriage, losing a job, losing a breast. There's so many things that can happen in life that can result in profound grief. And there's a lot of very lonely, isolated people who are grieving without support. So that was my intention, was to reach those people in a much broader way through the podcast.
And it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, I think it's helpful for people who are grieving, for people who are educators, and for those wanting to support people who are grieving. And it does include, as you say, not just bereavement, but many other forms of loss, and shows you kind of examples of how different grief is and how it can be experienced. So thank you for that. So one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you today is about grief therapy itself and some of the kind of physical effects of grief. I think people expect when they have a loss that they're going to feel sad, but they don't always expect the physical sensations, how it hits them, in a kind of embodied way. I wondered if you could say something about the kind of physical aspects of grief, which might come as a surprise.
Yeah, sure. And there's just so much to say about this as well. I think for many people, our basic understanding of grief is someone we love dies. It's an event in our lives. We feel sad about it, and then we get on with our lives. And until we've experienced a profound loss, that tends to be our understanding of grief. But grief is so different. Where do you even begin? There's just so many layers when we're talking about grief. There's so many different types of grief. And grief is very much, there's the feeling of grief, and then there's also the grieving process. There's so much involved. There's so many different layers. It affects us on every single level of our being. I would say there is not a cell in our bodies that is not touched by our experience of grief. And obviously, the more profound the grief, the deeper the physical experience as well. Like I said, there's so many different factors, and I don't want to simplify it, but I will simplify it for the sake of, our hour together today. Grief has a profound physical impact on our bodies. It's like such a shock when, let's talk about a bereavement. If somebody we love dies, they don't look like they're sleeping. They look like they're dead. That's what I think anyway. And it can be profoundly shocking to see someone we love who no longer has life in them. It's incredibly dysregulating as well. So we are hardwired human beings, hardwired for connection. We need each other. We need interdependence with other people. We need relationships. Even those of us who are super important, are super independent, we constantly need to feel other people around us, even if it's just in our interactions in the coffee shop in the morning. It's like sort of regulating us in the world. So when someone we love dies, it has a profound dysregulating effect on our bodies. It's like, the way grievers describe it is, it's like the rug was pulled from under me. It's like I shattered into 1,000 pieces. It's like everything I knew about myself just dissolved. So this can manifest in a number of different ways physically. For anyone who understands the polyvagal theory, it's like this profound stressor that hits our nervous system, and out of our sort of comfort zone where we might have been going along in life, happy, regulated, every now and again getting a bit stressed, but then coming back down. When someone we love dies, we can be propelled up into that nervous system response that's fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system response, where we have a cocktail of hormones are released in our bodies, such as adrenaline and cortisol. And these have a profound effect on our bodies. These are getting us ready for mobilization. So to run or fight the threat, even though the threat in the case of bereavement is an emotional threat, someone we love has died, but our bodies don't know the difference. Our bodies don't know the difference between a profound loss and a profound threat. So that our bodies will respond, if you like, as if we're about to be consumed by a lion, which can make us feel very anxious. So C.S. Lewis wrote in his lovely book, "Nobody ever told me that grief felt so much like fear." And this is one of the symptoms that a lot of grieving people will report. I just don't feel right. I'm anxious, I'm worried, I'm not sleeping. So it's like their nervous system is completely activated. Now, with that nervous system activation, different things happen in our bodies to get us ready for mobilization. So the blood drains from our digestive system. Sometimes we might vomit, if we hear someone we love has died, we could vomit, we have diarrhea, we can have pains in our tummy. Children will often report pains in their tummy, when they're grieving. So our digestion can slow down, our heart can ache. And we know that the cortisol running through our bodies can actually weaken the tendons of the heart. And there is such a condition as broken heart syndrome. That's a thing, it's usually temporary, but for some people they can die from it. We are also more prone to heart attack. We're more prone to stroke following a bereavement. We're more prone to other things such as ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis. There's a lot of research that's been done that shows our bodies can become very vulnerable at times of bereavement. And it's largely due to this chronic or acute stress response that can remain chronic then. You'll often hear bereaved people talk about their mind. I can't read, I can't think, I don't know what I need, I can't plan anything. Maybe they've difficulty regulating their emotions. And this is to do what's happening in our brain at times of intense stress. Our amygdala, the very old part of our brain, can swell up and it's starting to run the show. But also blood is drained from our frontal lobe, our prefrontal cortex, to go into our muscles to get ready to fight or run. And it's this sort of draining of blood there, which is leaving the frontal cortex less able to plan and take action and emotionally regulate. So there's a lot going on. That explains the fog of bereavement that many people report as well.
So can you tell us a bit more about grief therapy? I'm thinking that there might be people out there who've had a bereavement, or perhaps they know someone who's had a bereavement. They're thinking about grief therapy, but they don't really know, what it is, what it involves, what a session might consist of.
Yeah, and there isn't a template, if you like, Lesel. But what I would say is really, really important is when you're looking for somebody to work with, if you are grieving, make sure you find someone who really is grief informed. I know the NICE standards and guidelines, I think it's 2012 in the UK, maybe it's 2009, I don't remember, would say that, we need to do at least 100 hours of grief education as part of our undergraduate degree, and then at least 12 hours of, grief CPD work every year to keep on top of it. Most of us don't do that. Most of us don't have that. Unfortunately, in many educations for counselors and psychotherapists, they're still learning stages of grief theory, which was never meant to be a grief theory in the first place. And there'd be no talk of, Strobe and Schutz's dual process model, or Robert Niemeyer's narrative therapy and meaning making, or some of the task models of grief, William Worden's work, certainly disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss. There's so many theories and types of grief. And most people are working on a very outdated stages model, like I said, that was never meant to be for grief at all. So when we're looking for a grief therapist, we need to make sure that we're finding somebody who's educated, who has done additional training, and who understands grief. And for me, this was really important to me, that if I was going to work therapeutically, that I really understood the area that I was working in, which is why I went and I did a master's in bereavement studies to fully understand as best I could this landscape of grief. Because while all our grief is unique, we're also very similar, and the more people that I support, the more I see, we are so similar as humans, and there's nuances or things that are different about our stories, but our human animalistic, mammalistic response can often be very, very similar and sometimes even predictable. So to be able to work with somebody who really has an idea when they meet you what might be going on for you, and then with you to make meaning out of your experience, is really, really important.
That makes perfect sense. I'm quite interested in hearing, in some ways, I know that every client is unique, and you might approach people differently, but just to get a kind of flavor of what a session would consist of. I think people sometimes have the idea of psychotherapy, someone sitting in a chair, the client lying on a couch. They might have a sort of vision of a particular form of therapy, but grief therapy is different from psychoanalysis, and it has other techniques and ways of sort of working with the client. I wonder if you could sort of give some examples where you've had permission, or talk about some of the techniques that you've used.
Yeah, and I suppose, this is the way that I work. It's not a generalized grief therapy template. I'm really lucky in that a lot of strands of my life have really come together in the way that I work now. So 20 years ago, I studied drama therapy. I did a master's in drama therapy. So I'm really interested in creative approaches to dealing with any sort of psychological distress. I've also trained as an open floor movement therapist. And that's a body-based approach to supporting ourselves, resourcing ourselves. And then, I have a master's in counseling and psychotherapy, which I'm just completing at the moment as well. So I use all of these strands. I bring them all in with the people that I'm working with. So I could work anywhere on the spectrum, from depending on who's presenting to me and how they're presenting. So with permission, I'm going to share a couple of examples. I've checked out with all of these clients in advance before I share their stories. And that's really, really important that people know that I don't talk about my clients generally. And I'm going to just change some of the details just so that they're not identifiable. But in the case of a young couple who came to me a year ago, and their child had just been diagnosed with a brain tumor, it was not looking good, but there was a little bit of hope. When they first presented, they were in absolute shock. So I could see in them, their bodies were completely activated. Their ability to think and plan and know what they needed was really, really compromised, to the extent that one of them was going from hospital to work to hospital to work to hospital to work with almost zero sleep over 3 weeks. Now, in that case, I was really quite directive, which you normally wouldn't be as a psychotherapist. Have you thought about talking to your HR department? Okay, they've told you they're going to be really supportive and they'll do what you need, but what does that mean? Does that mean they'll give you 6 months off work, 12 months off work? Will they pay you? Have you got 3 weeks? What does it mean? And I encouraged, the father in this case to actually have a meeting with his HR department and find out exactly what they meant by "we're here to support you." And he did that. And they said, "Oh yeah, like 6 months, fully paid, take it, go, mind your kid." And, in that case, I was kind of working as their prefrontal cortex because theirs wasn't available to them. Making that suggestion of, do you need this additional stress and strain right now? So very directive, very involved, if you like. That's one example of one session. All the way to the other end of the spectrum where, working with somebody who themselves, they're a psychotherapist, very seasoned, very emotionally mature and emotionally resilient, and they need a safe place where they can process their grief. And my input in that case is very little. I'm present, I'm holding space, I'm a compassionate ear, I'm sitting in the pit with them. And for this person, there's a little bit of every now and again questions or wonderings or reflecting back to them. But because she's so in tune with her own emotions and her own grief, has a high level of emotional intelligence, she really doesn't need that much input from me. And actually, to be as directive as I was with the first client with her would be a disaster. So as the grief therapist, I'm constantly needing to check in what is needed here. Sometimes it's counseling, it's really, or coaching even. And other times it's, a slower kind of psychotherapy where I'm sitting back and facilitating a process that they're in charge of. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And it's really interesting to hear the way you move around depending on what the client needs, and also being someone who can be quite practical, who knows your way around the system and can say, have you asked this question? Have you done this? I'm interested with the client who had the emotional intelligence and, who didn't need as much intervention. Do you think that for her, part of what she needed was a kind of support person, someone who is there where she can feel the grief in a sort of safe space? Like, what is that moment, that designated time, doing for that person in terms of their grief?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because what this person would say to me is, when they see me, they're immediately in the presence of their loved one who's deceased. So it's like the grieving space connects them with the love as well as the grief. And, a lot of the mental health adverts that are out there at the moment say, reach out, ask for support. And that's all very valid. But a lot of people also have a best by date in terms of their ability to show up and support. Many people want to get on with their own lives, or they get a little bit fatigued from being compassionate. Bereaved people can be very selfish and very self-consumed. It's normal. That's not a judgment. We're in survival mode a lot of the time. And for many people who aren't trained, as a mental health support person, that can be confusing and difficult, and they may not know what to do. So finding that safe space with somebody who's trained can be really, really vital. Somewhere where you can grieve, where you can say the unsayable, where you can say, actually, I really am angry with them. I hate the way they died. I hate the way they behaved. I resented that she was sick. I hate cancer. I hate my mother-in-law. You know, it's a space where you can give out about the other people who are supporting you, because, you know, when someone you love dies, everything goes pear-shaped. Like everything goes pear-shaped. A lot of your close relationships go pear-shaped as well, because of your nervous system and your activation. You know, people can piss you off and upset you or say the wrong thing, you know, invalidate your grief, not be able to join you in your grief because they're uncomfortable with their own sadness or their own grief. And so it's really important to have a space where you can go and process all of these relational difficulties and all of these secondary losses as well.
That makes perfect sense. And I mean, what one hears from grievers is that often they want to continue the conversation about the person who they have lost, and that after a certain point, no one wants to hear the name, wants to hear the story. They feel like they've been there, done that, the time is over. And I can see also that the therapeutic space is one that gives people permission to express emotions like the anger, frustration, you know, resentment, jealousy, that might be harder to articulate with friends. And I guess the other thing is that grief, you know, you were saying earlier, grief, it involves losing someone you love, but it also involves a kind of reconceptualization, you know, a rethinking, a reimagining of who you are and what your life consists of. And, you know, that is not a simple process. You know, it takes time. And you do need people who are willing to share that space, to witness the pain and not think you can just sort of solve it. And I suppose it's also a kind of a lesson for those of us who are supporting people who are bereaved, that simply being present, being able to really, you know, witness and share as much as we can their emotions, to validate them, is itself, you know, quite a compassionate act of generosity. So that if people think, oh, I don't know what to say, actually being there for them, being present, letting them talk, listening, is something that we need to do more of.
Absolutely. Like showing up despite the anger, showing up despite the rage, showing up despite the grumpiness, you know. And, you know, you're making me think of a really important factor of grief therapy is it's all that fallout. When someone dies, the fallout, you know, so you can have this primary loss that's devastating. But like I said, it's the fallout that can come in the other relationships, in your faith. Like, I used to believe in God, like I don't believe in that anymore. Or, you know, the universe will provide. Well, God, look what the universe has just gone and done to me. So people at a really profound level, or, you know, at an existential level, can really go into crisis. You know, gosh, like, why do I even want to live if we're just here and then we die? Like, what on earth is it all about? And people can really go into existential crisis and have, like you say, these big questions that most people can't really hear. Most people might say, well, oh gosh, don't be talking like that. Or, you know, you need to go out for a walk, or they try to fix it or offer advice. So to be able to sit with someone who's literally questioning, why would I want to live if this is all that's at the end of life? To sit there without solving it or fixing it or rubbing a salve on it, you know, to sit with that intense pain, which can manifest as anger or distress or shutdown, and just to sit there and patiently bear it. We're bearing someone's grief with them without trying to make it different.
Yeah.
It's the best we can do.
Do you have any examples? I'm interested in the fact that you did drama therapy, that you have this creative side to your practice. Do you use other creative techniques when you're with clients? Do you do other kinds of art or drama, for example?
Yeah, I do on a regular basis. So again, it depends on the individual person and what their needs are. And some people can be really suffering from grief and actually just not have language to describe how they're feeling. Maybe, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in Ireland, some of us, me included, as a younger person, I just had no emotional intelligence. If you asked me when I was 25, how did I feel? I'd be like, sorry, what? I had no idea how to be in touch with my emotions, or how to, never mind label them or name them. And, this is still the case for many people. And this is still the case for people who arrive into clinical practice. They just know that they're not okay. They know it's something to do with their recent bereavement, but they're not able to even name, I'm anxious, or I'm sad, or, to even decipher what's going on around them or in their relationships. And this is where the creative arts come in beautifully, because there isn't always a language for loss. There isn't always a language for what we're feeling or what's going on inside us. So to be able to express that, through painting or through drawing or through imagining someone sitting beside us, can be a really, really powerful tool. So, like, let's take anger, for example. Anger shows up a lot in bereavement. But for some people, anger is a bad emotion. We've decided that some emotions are bad and some emotions are good, which is nuts. They're all just emotions. But for some people, when you're told all your life, particularly women, don't do anger. That's you'll be judged. And this anger is boiling inside them, but they've never learned how to express their anger or how to lay down boundaries. Even just to get a pen, sometimes even on a Zoom call, I will say to someone, do you have a pen and paper near you? And pick up a pen. And even just to do this on the paper, and suddenly you can see the gestures are getting harder and deeper. And often what will come then might be a wail and sobbing. So we often see that anger is actually sitting on top of another emotion. And it's often grief, So when that anger can be expressed, even with just a pen and a paper, then the grief can come. So it's back to, supporting the body and what the body needs to do. When someone, this is important as well, Lisa, you said, in terms of supporting people, often people are really scared to say something or to approach someone who's grieving because they're afraid they'll make it worse. And for them, they interpret, oh, I made the person cry, and they think I made it worse. But actually, and we kind of know this from neuroscience, when our nervous system is really activated, when we're in that sympathetic arousal, we often don't cry. It's kind of not safe to cry. And when we cry, it's often a sign that there's been a shift in gear in our nervous system, and suddenly we're safe and the tears come. So it's such a positive thing when someone starts to cry. It's so positive for them. And it's such a gift to them if we can just simply be with them without saying, oh, I'm sorry I made you cry, or here's a tissue, or let's take your mind off it. It's actually a really positive, good, healing, useful, healthy thing when somebody cries in our presence, and that we can just be comfortable with that, because it is a sign of their nervous system shifting gears and becoming safe for that moment, safe enough to cry and to grieve.
And in a sense, it's the compliment that they trust us, that they can let their guard down. We long for the days post-COVID where if someone cries in front of us, we can give them a hug and we can offer them comfort and just simply sort of be there and be present. I like what you say about,
I want to pull you up on that just post-COVID as well, because there are ways we can touch people and be socially distant. And again, this is being creative. We have to start thinking outside the box, I have an elderly friend. She's not a client. She's a friend of mine. She's 80 and her wife died last year, just a couple of months before COVID hit. And research tells us that women in relationship with each other grieve at a really, really deep level, because often it's not just a relationship, but it's also a very deep friendship. And they're each other's friendship circle, and the emotional bond can be really, really, really strong. So with this friend of mine, protecting her because she's 80 and obviously very vulnerable, but also recognizing her total isolation in the midst of her grief, I took to visiting her with our masks on, and we'd sit in front of each other and let our toes touch. So we still had 2 meters between us. And I was able to just kind of with my feet, just, we'd take our shoes and socks off in the summer and just, touch our soles. It's a nice little metaphor, the soles of our feet, and just let her feel that physical feedback of somebody, even if it was just through her feet. Or on another occasion, to give her a hug, going behind her and just leaning my back into her back and letting her lean into me. So again, we were being protective in that we weren't face to face with any sort of pulmonary fluids, but yet still finding ways to connect in a meaningful way that was supportive to her.
That's lovely. Soul to soul. I think that's very nice. And you're right. I can see how any kind of contact, physical comfort can be so comforting, really, for people who are on their own and isolated and grieving.
Well, on a physiological level, when we connect physically with someone, they say a hug of 20 seconds or more actually stops our secretion of stress hormones and instead secretes oxytocin, which is the same hormone as is released when we're breastfeeding. It's our attachment hormone. So a long, lingering physical connection with someone can do wonders for their nervous system at times of grief.
Can you say something? Those are all really amazing examples, and I hope it encourages people who've been a bit nervous about grief therapy to kind of see what the various possibilities are and to think of that as something for them. I wonder if you're willing to talk a little bit about your own experiences of loss and grief, because I'm a long-standing fan of Shapes of Grief. I've heard you talk about your own life. And I wonder if you're willing, and you talk about it on some of your blogs as well, I wonder if you're willing to share some of your stories and maybe think a little bit about, if your work as a therapist has helped you, given you insight, or whether, when you're a griever, there's almost a limit that knowledge only gets you so far.
Yeah, there's 100% correlation, right? And in fact, I know probably from the Good Grief Fest, you find this, but in my Shapes of Grief education project, which I'm working on at the moment, everyone involved, although they're all professors and psychologists and doctors, they've all had a significant loss. And that's why they're in the area that they're in, So I suppose, there's different shapes of grief, right? And it's not always a bereavement. It can often be something that we don't recognize at all. And in my case, I was the 5th child in a Catholic family. My mother was nearly 50 when I was born. She was exhausted. I was born because of Catholic Ireland. There was no contraceptives, and that was made no secret. But she suffered really badly from mental health issues when I was young, so she was absent. So I had a mother, but I didn't have a mother who was present. And I think for me, and we know now with current research in adverse childhood experiences and attachment theory, I didn't have that secure attachment as a child, and I had what would be called significant adverse childhood experiences. So that left a kind of a longing and a looking, a searching. I was always kind of searching for this missing thing in my life. And I was very resourceful as a child. I wasn't doing it consciously, but I would call into my neighbors' houses at tea time so that I would get fed. And I would call in to, mind their kid or watch the dog I was resourceful in that way. I used to also go into my next door neighbor who was a raving alcoholic and a chain smoker, but I had her full attention. I would never talk, but she would chain smoke and drink her sherry and tell me about her life. And somehow I got comfort from this. It was somebody who was talking to me and seeing me, if you like. So when I was 12, and you've probably heard me mention this in the podcast, she died suddenly. And it was really a traumatic loss for me because it was disenfranchised. Nobody acknowledged it. This was just my neighbor. But for me, she was my primary attachment figure. And even more so than her was her two dogs, who I had grown up with. She had these two poodles called Susan and Tina. But I was so close to these dogs. I walked them every day. I adored them. So she died and the dogs were taken away. Massive, a massive loss for me. But even coming into the house the day I found out, my parents, telling me that she had died. And I remember just saying, okay, and walking upstairs, and we just didn't do emotions. It was like there was something dirty about emotions. Like we didn't even say I love you, in our house. And that was pretty common in Ireland in those days. But I remember going up to my bedroom and getting a pair of socks that were rolled in a ball and shoving them in my mouth and just putting my head under a pillow and then letting the wail, like I had felt this wail, rise in me, but I'd kept it in. Letting the wail out then, but through the muffled socks and the pillow. So again, just not recognized. She died, and I remember I really wanted her typewriter, but of course nobody was thinking of the kid next door and the relationship I had. She had no family. She had a nephew who was in the UK. He'd no idea who I was. So this was a big loss that was not recognized really by anybody. That was, apart from sort of losing my mom to mental illness and then losing Mrs. Hoskins at the age of 12, into the teenage years. And then a friend of mine was killed. She fell off a bridge one night and literally died. And again, it wasn't talked about. We didn't talk about it. Nobody acknowledged it with me. Did I even tell my parents that Julie had died? I honestly don't even remember. But I do remember being at her funeral, feeling horrific and keeping the emotion in because we just didn't know how to grieve, So, I had a few other losses like that.
Yeah, it reminds us to be really attentive to the fact that we don't know how a person is grieving, in terms of the relationship, that you can't make a judgment from the outside. And, we all say there is no hierarchy of grief, and yet in people's minds, there often is. And really, you have to think about that individual relationship, and it will have, and how that relationship determines how the grief is then experienced.
And what that person meant to you. And actually, it's interesting in the case of Julie, because Julie was lovely. She was a year ahead of me in school. But we would never have been friends in school. But at a certain point, I signed up for art classes in a local town. And when I got there, there was Julie, and she'd also signed up for art classes. And we were like, oh, let's sit beside each other. We knew each other from school. And then we decided to leave the art class early and go and buy chips. And then the following week we said, well, we just go and buy chips and not actually go to the art class. So we both got money from our parents to go and do this art class. But fast forward 6 months, we didn't go to any of them. But every Thursday, we both left our houses, met each other, pretended we were going to art class. But actually, we went for walks on the beach. We talked in the park. We spent all this gorgeous time together. And I could never tell my parents, I'm actually really close to this girl who's died, because I've spent every Thursday evening with her for the last 6 months, because I was meant to be in art class. Yeah. So you just never know.
No, and somebody your age as well, or near about, I think has a different impact in terms of that could be you. And it's a different kind of way that your own mortality suddenly becomes sort of visible and present in a way that someone who, especially when you're young, anybody over 35 is elderly, and so you don't really think of that as impacting on your own sort of lifespan. But no, really powerful stories, both of them. And again, this not talking about it, not expressing it, which, we can imagine fed into this desire to be an art therapist, to figure out what's happening, to try to get doing this the correct way and help other people not to be in that position where they're effectively silenced.
I think you carry it with you. It's always there. It's always in your system until you write it or you paint it or you speak it. Or you dance it or you run it. I believe that grief needs expression 100%. Everything that we have inside us needs expression. And if we don't express, it's dangerous for us. It's always there. It's always scratching at us. And
or we express it physically, that you end up expressing it through the physical impacts that are quite dangerous, and actually getting it out through words or dance. And it helps us to believe that the event has actually happened, because I think sometimes with a death, it's hard to even take in that this is real. So it helps with kind of sort of recognizing an event, and also, the kind of meaning that you make out of it, trying to take this event and weave it back into an understanding of your life, of who you are.
Absolutely. And like meaning making is so important, because what we know about trauma is it's not so much what happens you, it's the meaning you make of it that will determine your outcome. So two people can be in a car crash. One people can go, that was nasty, shall we go for lunch? And the other person can just be left completely shook and for years and suffer from PTSD. And, there's a couple of things at play. It's the meaning we make of it, but it's also, who is this person? What is their system? What do they know about loss? Have they a secure attachment base? Are they well resourced? All of these things determine how we respond to grief or trauma. So grief therapy is really understanding not so much what's the story you're bringing to me, but what is going on in your body, in your system right now? What does this mean to you? How is this affecting you? Why is this a problem for you?
Yes. I remember from your podcast, and I can't remember who it was now, but there was a woman who was on whose mother had died, and she had a very peaceful death, but she experienced trauma following this for a series of reasons. Again, a little bit like the relationship, not making judgments on the grief based on the relationship. You can't make judgments about the grief in terms of the context of the death. Although we do know that, sudden death, violent death, there's certain circumstances that make you more at risk for trauma. You can also have trauma even under anticipated deaths, and where things, kind of go as well as they can do in that context.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you have any words of wisdom, as it were, for our listeners at home? You've given us lots already, but some of your sort of top tips really in thinking about how we support other people who are grieving, if we're grieving ourselves, what advice you would give. I'm sure there's lots to be taken from this whole interview, but if there's a few things to kind of leave our watchers, our audience with, what would they be?
I would say be in it for the long run. It's not about being the first person up there with the lasagna on the door. If you really want to support someone, be in it for the long run. We know from grief in the body that often in the first few weeks or months, it can be quite surreal. There can be quite a lot of trauma. We've got all these hormones going around our bodies, and the full impact of our loss can be months down the road, even years down the road. Often for people, the first year is just about surviving, getting through, passing the anniversaries, getting through certain milestones. And then you get through year one, you go, oh, thank God I did that. And it's almost like you're going, you can come back now. And then the realization of, oh my God, I have to do that again and again and again forever. It's like the permanence of the loss only hits, down the road. And that's where it can be really, really lonely, because everybody who was fluttering around in the early days, they're gone. They've gone back to their lives. They think they're okay now. So, supporting someone who is grieving, like I have a friend and her sister died by suicide 2 years ago. I will always be supporting a bereaved sister. She will, that's who she is amongst lots of other things. But that piece of her will always be present when I'm with her. How are you? How are you? It was her birthday last week. What did that mean to you? It's always going to be there. So we need to know that there isn't a sudden line that they cross where you go, well, that's it. We don't talk about that person anymore. They're over it. We need to keep talking about that person and checking in with them. I would also say that things aren't always as they seem. So when somebody's going around and planning a funeral and going through the motions, and you think, oh my gosh, they're so strong, they could be just in complete nervous system freeze. And it could be 6, 12, 18 months down the line where the grief really hits them. So things aren't always as they seem. Saying things like, you look well, or you're so strong, can be so painful, because inside someone can be dying, just feeling awful. So, to say what you think is going on for them can be really unhelpful. More ask, how are you today? Not generally. Show up and shut up. Like, just show up and be there. Don't bring, your own stuff and your own life has to be put on hold for a while. And that's the way it is. And, I have a couple of friends. I have 2 friends at the moment who are deeply, deeply grieving. And both of their personalities are such that they find it really hard to have the spotlight on them. And they also find it quite hard to accept support. So I find with both of them, that I might be offering some support and we're talking about what's going on for them. And then at a certain point, they'll go, how are you? And for their sake, I might say, oh, well, here's this and that and the other. And then I'll gently bring it back to them. But I do that just because I know they need a bit of respite and they need the spotlight off them because it's uncomfortable for them. But generally, people aren't able to take in what's going on in our lives. They're in survival mode. It's like we're dealing with, I see this with some clients and some friends, and I've felt it myself in different losses. It's like your skin has been ripped off you and you're that vulnerable. It's like, how can you show up literally or metaphorically with a big soft blanket and just be the one to wrap it around them and be with them in that state of distress or state of pain? Really, that's what's needed. And it's like deep levels of empathy, of, sort of feeling enough into it to get a sense of what's going on for them, and then just imagining what might be needed. And often when we're in that levels of distress, if you were to find an injured animal, keep them safe, keep them warm, keep them hydrated and nourished, and reassure them. Tell them it's okay, it's okay right now. I'm here. You'll get through this in time.
That's wonderful advice. I also think if you say to people, you look so great, or you're being so strong, it kind of means that they don't have, it's almost not giving them permission to be anything but that, that they have to step over that hurdle in order to say, well, I'm not okay.
One of my clients who's given me permission to talk about her, her child died a few months ago, and she's really resourceful, like deeply grieving and really resourceful, and she's going to be okay. I think younger people are doing grief differently, and it'd be really interesting for somebody to research this. I'm noticing it in people in their 30s. There's a resilience there that I don't see in older people. And it's something to do with social media and being able to go online and look at how people grieve and choose not to go that way, but maybe I'm going to try this one on, So this woman, a couple of weeks after her child had died, she went out for a walk and she met a neighbor, and her neighbor said to her, "You're amazing. You're so strong. If it happened to me, I'd be curled up in bed under the duvet." And, the neighbor meant well, but what that did to my client was she then went home going, am I doing this wrong? Should I not go out for walks? like, am I a total bitch that I'm not under my duvet? How can I go for a walk? Like, it sent her into a complete downward spiral.
Yeah.
Because the judgment, it is a judgment. You're so strong. That's a judgment. So don't make assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, just asking how people are rather than assuming that you know how they're doing seems to be, key. I like the show up and shut up. I feel like that's probably a good point at which to end with that advice. It's nice and catchy. Show up and shut up, listen. It's been so completely wonderful getting the chance to talk to you today. I am a longstanding fan. I've benefited myself personally from your wisdom over the years. And it's great to hear a little bit more about your therapy, your practice, your podcast, and indeed your life that's kind of led you to this path. So there's no much more to do really, but just to say a huge thank you for today. And thank you to everyone at home for watching this.
Thanks so much, Lesel. Lovely to be here.
Bye.
Bye.